8 months pregnant, I came to court for a divorce. But when my husband's mistress hit me in front of everyone, the judge suddenly ordered the courtroom sealed. The slap echoed across the entire courtroom. Not a movie slap, not a dramatic slow-motion thing, a real one. The kind that makes the air hiss right before impact, the kind that lands like a door slamming shut on every version of your life you thought you were still going to have. My cheek burned immediately. I tasted copper at the corner of my lip, and my hand, before I even processed what had happened, shot down to cover my stomach. 8 months pregnant, alone, just been struck in open court, in front of a bailiff, a stenographer, 2 clerks, and the Honorable Judge Randall Thompson of the Riverside County Family Court. And my husband, Harrison Prescott, looked at Tiffany's hand, the hand that had just connected with my face, and he laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly enough to be obvious, just a quiet, exhaled laugh, like someone had told a joke only he and Tiffany were in on. That sound, that quiet, private laugh in a room full of people watching me bleed, that was the moment I stopped being afraid of him. I need to go back 6 years, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning doesn't look like what you'd expect. It never does. I was 26 when I met Harrison Prescott at a corporate philanthropy event my mother dragged me to. She ran Miller Manor Group, a mid-sized real estate investment firm my grandfather had built from nothing in the 1970s. Not flashy, solid. The kind of company that owns 12 apartment buildings in the Inland Valley and a handful of commercial leases and shows up to neighborhood council meetings. Mom wanted me to network. I wanted to go home and watch bad television. Harrison was 41, which seemed impossibly sophisticated to me then. He had the kind of jaw and vocabulary that belonged to men who've spent their entire lives being told they're exceptional. CEO of Prescott Strategic Holdings, on the board of 2 children's hospitals, profiled in California Business Quarterly the year before for his quiet philanthropy. I should have noticed even then how much he loved that word, quiet. He applied it to everything he did, as if virtue that wasn't being monitored barely counted. We dated for 8 months. He was charming and attentive in that specific, practiced way that's very hard to distinguish from genuine love when you're 26 and your mother is slowly getting sick and the world feels enormous and frightening. We got married in Napa, 70 guests, wildflowers. My mother danced. The red flags were there, if I'd known how to read them. He suggested early on that I should step back from helping with Miller Manor Group, not control it, just help my aging mother with administrative tasks. He framed it as concern. You're exhausted. Let the professionals handle it. He introduced me to a financial manager named Dennis, who I understand now was on Harrison's payroll. When my mother died 18 months into our marriage, fast, merciless, a stroke followed by 2 weeks in hospice, I was so hollowed out by grief that I signed whatever Harrison put in front of me without reading it. I thought I was signing probate paperwork. I wasn't, but I didn't know that yet. I wouldn't know that for 4 more years. The first time I noticed something was genuinely wrong, not just Harrison is difficult and cold wrong, but structurally, legally wrong, was 14 months ago. I was 5 months pregnant, our daughter kicking her first real kicks, and I was trying to update the beneficiary information on a life insurance policy. The financial manager, Dennis, had retired. Harrison had replaced him with someone I'd never met. I called the new firm to get some basic documents, and they told me, very politely, that I wasn't listed as an authorized contact on the accounts. I'm sorry, I said. I'm his wife. Yes, ma'am. But the authorized contacts on this account are Mr. Prescott and a Ms. Tiffany Graves. I laughed. I assumed it was a clerical error. I told myself that for 3 weeks. Then I found the hotel receipts in his laptop bag. Not even hidden. Just sitting there. A folded printout. 2 nights at a Santa Barbara resort. Dates that aligned with a conference Harrison had taken alone. The room was booked under his name and hers. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after that. My daughter kicked twice, then was still. I didn't confront him immediately. I know people always wonder why victims don't just say something. But I was 8 months pregnant, financially dependent on a man whose name was on every account I thought we shared. And I had just discovered that the woman listed as an authorized contact on my own financial documents had been sleeping with my husband. I called my college roommate, Dara, who worked as a paralegal in Sacramento. Dara said 3 things. Document everything. Don't move money. Get a divorce attorney immediately. I called Simon Fletcher the next morning. Simon Fletcher had been practicing family law for 19 years. His office in Riverside was unglamorous, a converted Victorian with mismatched furniture and a receptionist named Brenda, who had the energy of a woman who had seen everything and was unimpressed by all of it. He shook my hand, looked at me over his reading glasses, and said, "Before you tell me anything, I want you to understand that your husband has already contacted my firm." I went very still. "He called last week," Simon said. Said he was considering divorce proceedings and asked about our availability. He was, I believe, shopping for attorneys who might represent him, or who he might be able to block from representing you. Can he do that? Simon smiled thinly. He tried. "We had a conflict check done this morning before your appointment. You contacted us first. On the record, you're my client." That was the first moment I understood the scale of what I was dealing with. Harrison hadn't just been cheating. He'd been planning. He had started building the architecture of this divorce before I even knew the marriage was ending. Simon began pulling records. It took him 2 months, a forensic accountant named Patricia Haynes, and 3 subpoenas. What they found made my hands shake for days. Miller Manor Group, my mother's company, my inheritance, the thing my grandfather had built with 40 years of his life, had been transferred via a fraudulent document bearing my signature into a shell corporation called Apex Mistress Miller Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware. Sole managing member, Harrison James Prescott. The signature on the transfer document was dated 11 days after my mother's funeral. That's not my signature, I told Simon. He nodded. He already knew. He had a handwriting analyst, Dr. Yolanda Marsh, who had been comparing signatures for 22 years, and Dr. Marsh had already submitted a 12-page report, concluding that the signature was a traced forgery. He stole my mother's company, I said. Yes, Simon said. He didn't soften it, and we're going to get it back. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in October. I was 34 weeks pregnant. My ankles were the size of melons, and I had developed the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained, grinding fear. The night before, Simon called me at 9:47 p.m. I need you to listen carefully, he said. Harrison's legal team filed a motion at midnight. They're claiming a scheduling conflict with their lead counsel. The clerk's office accepted it. They've scrambled the docket. What does that mean? It means your hearing is still on, but I may not be able to appear in time. They'll argue procedural confusion. It's a stall tactic. Can I postpone? Simon was quiet for a moment. Sarah, if you postpone, Harrison will use it. He's already filed a motion suggesting you're emotionally unstable and unfit. He has 3 witnesses prepared to testify to that. If you don't appear, he wins the narrative. Yes. I lay awake until 3:12 a.m. with my hand on my stomach. My daughter rolled and shifted, doing whatever babies do in the dark hours before everything changes. I wore my navy dress to court, the one that still fit. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings because I needed to feel like someone formidable had my back, even symbolically. I drove myself to the Riverside County Courthouse, and I sat down in courtroom 7 at 8:45 a.m. Simon's chair was empty. Harrison arrived at 9:02 with a team of 3 attorneys and Tiffany Graves on his arm. She was wearing a cream blazer and the specific smile of a woman who believes she has already won. Neither of them acknowledged me when they walked past. They sat at the plaintiff's table, and I sat at the defense table alone, with my legal folder and my grandmother's earrings and my 34 weeks pregnant body, and I waited. Harrison came to me before the judge entered. His lawyers stayed at their table. He crouched slightly, which was a performance of casualness because Harrison was not a casual man, and put his hand on the back of my chair. Sign the settlement, he said quietly. Charcoal suit, cold eyes, the same cologne he'd worn on our wedding day. Walk away with whatever dignity you have left. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Basic child support, my share of the marital assets, medical coverage through delivery, that's it. From behind him, Tiffany made a sound. Fairness? She said, loud enough that 2 clerks looked up. You trapped a successful man with a pregnancy, and now you want fairness? I turned and looked at her directly. Don't speak about my child. Her smile vanished so fast it was almost clinical, like a light switched off, and then her hand moved. I saw it in the half second before it landed. I saw the intent in her shoulder, in the rotation of her wrist, and I couldn't move fast enough. The slap connected with my left cheek at full force. The sound bounced off every wall. The stenographer made a sharp noise. The bailiff stood up. I tasted blood. My hand went to my stomach, not my face. Harrison said, "This is exactly the instability I've been warning everyone about. My instability." I was the pregnant woman sitting alone at a table with a bleeding lip, and he was describing my instability. I looked down at my shaking hands. Then I looked up, and I saw Judge Randall Thompson. He had not moved. He had not reached for his gavel or his notes or anything procedural. He was completely still in his chair, his document forgotten, staring directly at me with an expression I had never seen on a judge's face before. It wasn't neutrality. It wasn't the practiced, bureaucratic blankness that judges cultivate like a professional tool. It was something older and harder and much more dangerous. He looked for a moment, like a man who had seen something he could not unsee, and had made a decision about it. "Bailiff," he said. His voice was the same temperature as a sealed room in winter. "Seal the courtroom." The heavy doors swung shut with a sound like the end of something. I want to describe what it feels like when the balance of power shifts in a room. It doesn't feel like victory. Not at first. It feels like the air pressure changing, the way it does before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere is doing something enormous and invisible and you can feel it in your molars. Harrison's smirk flickered, just once. His lead attorney, a man named Gerald something, leaned toward him and whispered. The judge spoke my full name. Sarah Jane Miller Prescott. Harrison went completely still. That middle name. He had been erasing it for 6 years. Miller was my mother's family name, my grandfather's name, the name on the building my grandmother used to drive me past when I was small and tell me with enormous pride, "That's ours, baby." Harrison called it old history. He said it was unnecessary weight. He had introduced me at every Prescott event as Sarah Prescott, just that, nothing before or attached. I had let him. I understood now why he'd needed me to. "Mr. Prescott," Judge Thompson said, "are you familiar with the emergency filing submitted to this court at 7:15 this morning?" Harrison's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client's wife has demonstrated a pattern of emotional instab." "I did not ask for your opinion," the judge said. "Sit down." Silence crashed down like a wall falling. In 19 years of marriage court, I don't know if Gerald something had ever been told to sit down with that particular intonation. He sat. "Mr. Prescott, the filing." "Your Honor," Harrison said carefully. He had recovered some composure. He was very good at recovering composure. It was one of the things I had admired about him once. "I'm not aware of any emergency filing. My team prepared for a standard." The judge picked up a document from a folder that had not been on his bench when we entered. He read aloud. He read for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I counted. I counted because counting was the only thing keeping me from shaking apart. He read from medical records. My prenatal records specifically, including notes from my OB, Dr. Renata Vasquez, who had flagged elevated stress markers at 4 of my last 6 appointments and had documented in her clinical notes that I had arrived at a 30-week appointment with bruising on my left arm consistent with grip pressure. I had told her I'd bumped a door frame. She had written, patient's account inconsistent with injury pattern, possible domestic stress, will monitor. He read from bank statements, forensic analysis by Patricia Haynes, CPA, 19 years in forensic accounting, showing the systematic transfer of assets from jointly held accounts into corporate accounts controlled by Apex Miller Holdings, LLC, beginning the day of my mother's funeral. He read from corporate transfer documents with a highlighted annotation from Dr. Yolanda Marsh, handwriting analyst. Signature on document dated November 14th is inconsistent with known exemplars from the subject. Probability of forgery, 96.3%. He read from an affidavit, Simon's affidavit. He hadn't abandoned me. He had been building something Harrison couldn't touch. He had filed the emergency motion at 7:15 a.m., before the courtroom opened, before Harrison's team could respond, before the scrambled docket gave them a procedural foothold. Asset freeze, requested. Protective order, requested. Fraud investigation referral to the Riverside County DA's Economic Crimes Unit, requested. Then the judge set down the document, removed his glasses, and said 2 words that stopped the blood moving in my veins. Miller Manor Group, my grandfather's name, my mother's company. The thing Harrison had told me was worthless, unsalvageable, not worth keeping, right before he forged my signature and put it in his pocket. Did you present fraudulent transfer documents to this plaintiff? The judge said, looking directly at Harrison, moving her inheritance into a shell corporation under your sole control? Gerald something grabbed Harrison's arm. Too late. Harrison's face was a complicated thing to watch. He was a man who had spent his whole life controlling the narrative, and the narrative was leaving the room without him. Tiffany's face had gone gray. She was looking at the sealed doors like she was calculating the distance to them. The judge continued reading. Text messages, retrieved from a backed-up device, my old phone, which Simon's forensic tech, a contractor named Marcus Webb, who had 12 years in digital forensics, had recovered from a cloud archive Harrison didn't know still existed. Messages from Harrison to Tiffany, dated while I was at prenatal appointments. She's at the doctor until noon. Go to the house and remove the accordion files from the office closet before she gets back. Messages outlining attempts to access my private medical records through a contact at my OB's billing office. A message, 3 weeks old, sent from Harrison's personal phone. If she doesn't sign by the 14th, have the locks changed while she's at her next appointment. I'll handle the scene. He had planned to lock me out of my own home, 8 months pregnant, while I was at a prenatal appointment. The evidence supports her statement in full, the judge said. His voice hadn't changed temperature once, and it supports several additional statements she hadn't even made yet. Then the courtroom doors opened. Simon Fletcher walked in looking like he'd survived a war in the last 3 hours, which, I would learn later, he essentially had. His tie was crooked. There was a bruise forming along his left jaw. His phone was gone. Someone had taken it from his pocket in the parking garage. It wasn't random. Harrison's people had known exactly which garage Simon used. They'd had someone watching. Simon walked to my table, set down a new folder, and sat down beside me. He looked at my face, at my cheek, at the split corner of my lip, and something in his expression went very quiet. I'm sorry I'm late, he said. You're exactly on time, I said. The judge had watched all of this without comment. Now he looked at Tiffany Graves, who was still sitting at the plaintiff's table, her cream blazer suddenly looking like a costume from the wrong play. Ms. Graves, he said, you are not a party to these proceedings. You struck a protected individual in my courtroom. You will be held pending a determination of contempt, and separately, will be referred to the district attorney's office regarding the assault of a pregnant woman. Tiffany opened her mouth. You may remain silent, the judge said. I strongly recommend it. She remained silent. The room felt different now, like the tide had gone out on something enormous, and what was left on the shore was just the actual truth of everything. One by one, the judge moved through the motions. Protection order, granted, effective immediately, covering me, my unborn daughter, and my primary residence. Marital home, transferred to my sole possession pending final divorce decree. Harrison was ordered to vacate by 5 p.m. that evening. Medical insurance. Harrison was ordered to restore my coverage, which his attorney had quietly canceled 2 months prior, within 24 hours. The judge noted that canceling a pregnant woman's health insurance constituted a specific category of potential criminal liability and said so plainly. Every account connected to Harrison's name that contained assets later determined to be fraudulently transferred, frozen, pending investigation. Miller Manor Group placed in receivership pending the fraud investigation. With my claim to full restoration of ownership documented on the record, Harrison objected to every single ruling. He objected eloquently. He objected procedurally. He objected personally. At one point, he objected with the specific outraged tone of a man who had never, in his 47 years, been told he couldn't simply have what he wanted. He lost every single time. His attorney stopped objecting after the third loss. Attorneys learn when a room has turned. Gerald Something had been in courtrooms for a long time. He could feel it too. At one point, Harrison leaned toward me across the table. A mistake. A stupid, arrogant Harrison Prescott mistake. You'll regret this, he said, low enough that it was clearly meant only for me. I'll make sure you regret threat, Mr. Prescott. The judge's voice was a wall. You just threatened a protected individual inside my courtroom, in front of this bench, while this proceeding is being transcribed in full. Harrison looked up. She is not simply your wife, Judge Thompson said. She is a citizen of this state, a patient under active prenatal care, and an individual under the protection of this court. You will address her again in this room over my personal objection. Harrison closed his mouth. For the first time in 6 years, he had nothing to say. The gavel came down. I stood up slowly because standing up quickly was not something my body did at 34 weeks. My legs barely held me, not from fear, but from the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline for so long that the absence of threat feels like a vacuum. Simon steadied my arm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I looked at Harrison. He was leaning over the table, talking to Gerald something in a low, rapid voice, or trying to. Gerald was reading something, a document his own junior associate had just handed him, looking at it with the expression of a man who has stepped on a nail and hasn't decided yet whether to pull it out. Harrison took the document from him. He read it. The color drained out of his face so completely it was almost medical looking. His hands, those hands that had always been perfectly steady, that had signed checks and shaken hands and held champagne glasses with the practiced ease of a man who controlled every room he entered, those hands trembled. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 6 years, Harrison Prescott looked genuinely, authentically afraid. Not of consequences in the abstract, of me, specifically, of what I had done, what I had quietly assembled while he was busy being certain he'd already won. What is this? He whispered. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I want to say I felt triumph, or relief, or the specific vindication that the internet loves to imagine survivors feel. I did feel those things, eventually. But in that exact moment, looking at his gray face and his trembling hands, I felt something much quieter. I felt done. 6 years, my mother's company, my daughter's first months in my body, my split lip, my grandmother's pearl earrings, which I'd worn like armor. I felt done with all of it. It's the corrected record, I said, the real one, of everything. I picked up my folder. I straightened my grandmother's earrings, and I walked out of courtroom 7 while my husband stood there holding the evidence of everything he'd done and the full weight of what it was going to cost him. I should tell you what the document was, because you deserve to know. Simon's forensic team, in the 2 months before the hearing, had done something Harrison hadn't anticipated. They'd found Dennis. Dennis, the retired financial manager, the one on Harrison's payroll who had managed the paperwork around my mother's estate. Dennis was 63 and living in Scottsdale and had, it turned out, been feeling very guilty about several specific things for several years. When Simon's investigator found him and laid out the potential criminal exposure, accessory to fraud, conspiracy to commit forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, Dennis had decided that loyalty to Harrison Prescott was not worth a federal charge. Dennis had kept records, the real records, parallel documentation of every transaction, every transfer, every instruction Harrison had given him around the time of my mother's death. He'd kept them, he told Simon's investigator, because he was the kind of man who needed an exit strategy, even if he hoped he'd never need it. He needed it. The document Harrison was holding in the courtroom was Dennis's full-signed affidavit, 41 pages, with attachments, delivered to the court record that morning. It covered everything: the forged transfer, the shell company, the instructions Harrison had given Dennis about timing the paperwork to coincide with my grief, a specific email dated 2 days after my mother's funeral in which Harrison wrote, "She won't read anything carefully for at least a month. Move forward." That email would later become Exhibit A in the Riverside County DA's investigation. Harrison was charged 14 weeks later with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. He pled down to 2 counts and received, in addition to a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation, a permanent injunction barring him from serving in any fiduciary or executive capacity for 7 years. Miller Manor Group was returned to me in full. The buildings my grandfather built, the commercial leases, the quarterly reports my mother used to bring to the kitchen table, all of it back in my name. Tiffany Graves pled guilty to misdemeanor battery. She received community service and a fine. Harrison paid my legal fees, the forensic accountant, and Dr. Yolanda Marsh, by court order. Gerald Something, to his credit, sent Simon a short professional email saying he had not been aware of the full scope of his client's conduct and would not be representing him going forward. My daughter was born on a Wednesday 6 weeks after the hearing. I named her Eleanor, after my grandmother, who had driven me past the Miller Manor buildings when I was small and taught me what it meant to build something that lasted. After my mother, who had danced at my wedding and never lived to see how the story ended. Eleanor Jane Miller Prescott. All of the names, every single one. She was 8 pounds and 4 ounces, and she looked at me in the delivery room with the specific ancient expression that newborns have, the one that looks like they've just arrived from somewhere enormous and are deciding what to make of this new place. Dara was there. Simon had sent flowers. Dr. Vasquez, who had written possible domestic stress in her notes and never stopped watching, who had quietly photocopied every relevant document when Simon's office requested records. Dr. Vasquez came by during her break and held Eleanor for 7 minutes. I watched her hold my daughter, and I thought about all the people who had simply done their jobs, which was also another way of saying they had simply seen me. Dennis with his parallel records. Dr. Vasquez with her careful notes. Simon with a bruise on his jaw, walking into a sealed courtroom exactly when he needed to be there. Justice, it turns out, is not one dramatic gavel. It's 100 small acts of documentation in the hands of people people who refuse to look away. It's been 8 months since Eleanor was born. She's learning to sit up. She has strong opinions about bananas and a profound attachment to a stuffed bear named, by her own apparent decree, Ba. I go to the Miller Manor offices twice a week. We're renovating the Riverside building. New windows, updated units, the kind of work that costs money in the short term and lasts 30 years. My grandfather would have approved. My mother would have made an enormous spreadsheet and argued about every line item and then approved it anyway. I miss them both constantly. Harrison is somewhere in Los Angeles. I don't track him. I don't need to. The last I heard, he was consulting, quietly, as he always preferred, for a mid-sized firm that didn't know his history or knew and didn't care. That happens. The world is large and rich men often find softer landings than they deserve. But Miller Manor Group is mine. Eleanor is mine. My name, all of it, every syllable my family ever gave me, is mine. He lost everything he stole from me. In the end, he couldn't even keep the fear off his face. And I walked out of that courtroom, 8 months pregnant, pearl earrings, split lip, hand on my stomach. I walked out like someone who had always known exactly who she was. He just hadn't been paying attention.